My name is Steve Manal. I'm the Director of the College of Sustainability here at Dalhousie, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to another in our series of Environment, Sustainability, and Society lectures. Tonight's lecture, like a number of our lectures, is co-production, or really more an act of hospitality, where someone approaches us, or a group approaches us with an idea of something that's relevant to what we're doing, and also something that they have a great deal of passion about. And tonight we're pleased to co-present the talk with a number of folks who go by a variety of anonymous names such as the Platypus Society, which more you will learn about soon. I'm going to start by introducing our host for tonight, Anthony Melithopoulos. Anthony's a PhD candidate in an interdisciplinary PhD program here at Dalhousie, working with the School of Resource and Environmental Studies. His research interests are in ecological economics, political economy, agriculture, and honeybee conservation. He's a Canadian chair and secretary of the Dalhousie chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society, which is a public forum for radical intellectual conversation, not conservation. Although intellectual conservation might not be a bad idea either. And tonight's the fourth in a traveling panel discussion in this particular topic and series. The final event in this series will be held in New York in June, and I think Anthony will tell us a little bit more about how these events come together. Tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about freedom in the Anthropocene era. The Anthropocene is a somewhat disputed term, but it's a term that's been coined to define or to propose a definition for our current geological era of planetary history. An era that began with the Industrial Revolution and has been characterized by, from some points of view, an increase in human capacity, development, and potential. From other points of view, in an increase in the degradation of the natural environment and in a perhaps narrowing of human potentials. The real question is the relationship between humans and life on the planet in this era, and I think we'll have a very interesting discussion tonight about the implications of thinking about the present in Anthropocene terms. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anthony, and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Welcome to Freedom in the Anthropocene. As Stephen just mentioned, this is the fourth event in their series. It started in November at Loyola University in Chicago. It traveled to Goldsmiths University in London. It continued in January at York University in Toronto, and now we're here in Halifax. Thanks so much to the College of Sustainability, particularly to Stephen Manel and Deborah Ross for facilitating and making this possible. So, the Platypus Affiliated Society. We're a club here at Dalhousie and King's, and as Stephen mentioned, we organize reading groups, public forum, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old, new, and post-political left. We're interested in this history not for academic reasons, but because we think it's important to address the question of what the left, the political left, might yet become. We have another unrelated panel on radical ideology today, Marxism and anarchism, on Sunday at 2 p.m. at King, so I think there's flyers outside for that. If you're interested in the group, want to know more about it, there's a sign-up sheet up front, as well with Divest, which I believe have an event on Tuesday. I think next Tuesday we'll hear about it. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. To begin, we have Timothy Luke. And we're really glad to have him from Virginia. He's a distinguished professor in the Department of Political Science and the chair of Government and International Affairs at Virginia Tech. He's written extensively on the topic of environmental ecology and politics, including his 1999 book, Capitalism, Democracy, and Ecology, Departing from Marx, and his 1997 book, Eco-Critique, Contesting the Politics of Nature, Economy, and Culture. In September, we published a piece of his titled The Anthropocene and Freedom, Terrestrial Time as Political Mystification, in issue 60 of our Platypus Review, which is our free monthly broadsheet, which is available at the table out front. Next, we have James Hutt, who, as some of you might know, was named the Starfish list of top environmentalists under 25 last year. So I figured that most of you knew him or had worked with him. As you know, he's part of Divest Dalhousie, divest.dal.ca. That's an initiative to push the Board of Governors at Dal to pull investment from fossil fuel companies. Some of you may also know James from other venues in town. He's active all over the place with his different hats. He's also with the Halifax-based anti-capitalist group Solidarity Halifax. As well as prominent initiatives beyond campus in the HRM, working with the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition and traveling with the Canadian Youth Delegation to COP17. Beside James, we have Dave Bedford. Dave is a professor of political science at the University of New Brunswick. His scholarship includes work in ancient political thought, but also Aboriginal politics. And he also has a recent paper on the blues guitarist. His 2001 book with Dan Irving, The Tragedy of Progress, Marxism, Modernity, and the Aboriginal Question, is quite unique in drawing the tensions and relationships between the politics of the left and First Nations. Our final speaker will be Andrew Biro, who is the Canada Research Chair in Political Ecology, Environmental and Political Thought, and Professor of Political Science at Acadia University. He's interested in the intersection of critical and postmodern political theory and environmental politics. He recently edited a volume titled Critical Ecologies, the Frankfurt School and Contemporary Environmental Crises, and it also has a book out, Denaturalizing Ecological Politics, Alienation from Nature, from Rousseau to the Frankfurt School. Now, each speaker is going to have around 10 to 12 minutes for opening remarks. Jocelyn in the front there will help keep the time. And afterwards, we're going to take questions from the audience for the remainder of the time. I promise to have, I know the class ends at 5 to 9, and I promise to have us done by then. So at about 8:40, we'll take the last questions and allow the panelists to come up with their final remarks. Now, I just want to, all the panelists and all the series and all the locations all have the same description before them that's prompting their thought. I just want to read that description before we get going. The Dutch atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen recently characterized a period marked by the start of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century as a new geological age, the Anthropocene, as Stephen mentioned. This is meant to capture a change in the history of the planet, namely that for the first time, its course was to become a question of what humanity will make of itself, what humanity will become. While the idea of an era of planetary history driven by humanity would have been viewed as a great accomplishment by thinkers of the Enlightenment, it's been come to be associated with the potential demise of all life on Earth. This dual legacy, the dual legacy of the Industrial Revolution, and then what Crutzen terms the Great Acceleration, which you can see up in these graphs. There's this sort of other line where everything really ramps up after World War II. It has not, after all, led to the opening of human capacities and the flourishing of ecosystems, but rather the diminishment of those. The transition into the Anthropocene, however, also coincides with the expansion of what's been called bourgeois society. The society in which the productivity of humanity moved from rural forms of peasant production to production in the cities. Bourgeois literally means people of the cities. And the rise of the third estate, the commoners, who are not to be judged on the basis of tradition or privilege, but on their capacity to work. Taking the course of humanity out of the hands of fate, denaturing it, drawing it into the sphere of responsible human activity, not only marks the rise of levels of CO2 being laid down in the ice cores, but it also marks the appearance of freedom thinking in the 18th century and the early 19th century, exemplified by thinkers like Rousseau, Kant, Smith, and Hegel, as well as the attempt to invent actual freedom in the sphere of politics, the politics of the left. This panel tonight is going to focus on different interpretations of why the left has failed to deal with the deepening crisis of the Anthropocene through the 19th and 20th centuries, and how the history of the left is interrelated with the growing problems associated with ecological systems across the earth. While Karl Marx would note that the problem of freedom shifted with the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of the working class, the crisis of bourgeois society that Marx would term capital, the idea of freedom seems not to have survived. We now live in a world in which the fate of ecological systems seems foreclosed, where attempts at eco-modernization seem to emerge many steps behind the rate of ecological degradation. For many, degradation of the environment appears a permanent feature of modern society, something which can only be resisted but never transformed. What is the relationship between the history of capital and the left, and thus the issue of history and freedom? And how is it linked to our present inability to render environmental threats and degradation visible and comprehensible, and by extension, subject to its conscious and free overcoming by society? That's the topic for discussion tonight. And with that, I'd like to hand the mic over to Tim.
Thank you, Anthony, and to the College's Sustainability and Platypus Review and everyone else who's invited us here tonight to speak. I am to provide a brief overview or introduction. So my comments try to put some highlight on the very recent coinage, but now widespread acceptance and rapid circulation of the Anthropocene to characterize the crises of the current economic, political, social, and technological conjunctures that are circulating first in the terminologies of geoscience, stratigraphy, or paleontology, but are increasingly leaking out into almost all domains of public political discourse. On the one hand, this concept is still the subject of an ongoing scientific debate in these scientific communities, but on the other hand, it has been accepted with maybe a foregone conclusiveness as an already done and dusted discussion by quite a few humanists and post-humanists, environmentalists and social scientists, earth system scientists and policymakers as a pretext to, quote, do something, as Paul Crutzen suggests, about anthropogenic climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecological degradation. To date, a lot of these some things that must be done have sort of cashed out as writing polemical essays, editing some thematic anthologies, organizing scholarly conferences on the topic, but increasingly I think it's being used also to steer events, episodes, movements of activism. So to what extent does this discussion perhaps provide an overture to some kind of decisive radical action, or is it only a philosophical prelude to many new organizational operas, strategic symphonies, or disciplinary dances to be produced with so much power, wealth, and knowledge at stake by various national and transnational networks of technical, scientific, and policy experts who are seeking to gain authority as the environmental protection agencies of the Anthropocene, to maybe manage from above and afar, within and without, behind and beside many corporate, government, and social initiatives to mitigate, adapt to, or forestall rapid climate change by guiding the transition to a low-carbon economy. If that's done, that would be interesting, but the political question always has to be asked. Whom? Who's going to do it, and whom shall pay, and whom shall benefit? So the Anthropocene is a tag hung on the most recent era of human history, or say the past 250 years of the Industrial Revolution, or revolutions, which sometimes are counted in first, second, third, and maybe fourth, in which carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere have risen rapidly, over 40%. We are now creating, it appears, the highest average global air temperatures in thousands of years. There's a warming of the ocean's temperatures, an acidifying of marine environments, and the acceleration of Arctic and glacial ice melting. Paul Crutzen, who has been mentioned, along with Eugene Sturmer, who first began to coin and circulate the word in the 1980s, but it's Crutzen who really popularizes it since 2000, says essentially the Anthropocene idea, he wanted to be seen as a warning to the world of what humanity has created, and what it is, as it has created it, it is really entering a new epoch of geological time. The International Union of Geophysical Sciences has taken this word of warning up in deliberations over whether or not that the Anthropocene exists as such, and is going to decide by 2016 if we should differentiate it from the Holocene, which is basically the last era of the Cenozoic age, which goes back about 12,000 years. Meanwhile, it must be noted that this recognition has already been repeatedly made, but all too often ignored, while there was really a lot more wiggle room to change course. In other words, we have been creating and seeing an Anthropocenery of many kinds, but we just haven't recognized it. 150 years ago, George Perkins Marsh, in his Man and Nature, anticipated this anthropogenic turn. Joseph Fourier, in 1824, advanced the first calculations about the atmosphere's warming effects in the presence of greenhouse gases. John Tyndall, again in 1864, identified carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor as the key gases at play in these effects. For about 70 years, or since the Trinity Site A-bomb explosion outside Alamogordo, New Mexico on July 16, 1945, humanity has kept an unusual power to create anthropogenic ecological change on a planetary scale in a few days or maybe weeks, under control with much worry, until 1989, when, of course, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc fragmented, and there's been a much lessened fear about the idea of a thermonuclear holocaust. But quite clearly, that could also be a kind of Anthropocenery, although one that everyone wants to avoid. Ironically, that same year, Bill McKibben's The End of Nature begins many of our current debates about rapid climate change due to fossil fuel use, to awaken some to see this Anthropocenery of industrial urban society in a new light, and this is very clearly added to the debates over the past 25 years. Ironically also, Earth First once sought to also politicize geological time in the 1980s by calling on humanity to just forget about it and let's all go back to the Pleistocene. That hasn't been heeded, obviously. So I think we need to think about the contradictions that abound here. Industrial modernity and its progress are what permits 7 billion plus people to live on the Earth, albeit with very clear material inequalities between the top and bottom billions. But these fossil-fueled ensembles of hydrocarbon energy and corporate economy also are now the threat to all of humanity and non-humanity in the 21st century. Modernity, in a sense, once again has to be saved from itself. Also, at the same time, it is alleged that man has supposedly created this new epoch of geological time. But in fact, the Anthropocene would appear to be mostly a urb-Anthropocene. That is, the people who live in highly urbanized, industrialized, commercialized communities, which now are where, ironically, again, over half of all of the people on Earth reside, as of right around 2000 to 2010. This will rise to supposedly 60% of the global population by 2030 and perhaps 70% by 2050. In 20%, 50% of the urbanites were in cities that were a size of 100,000 to 500,000, and only 10% were in megacities of 10 million plus. But quite often it is those megacities of 10 million plus where one sees the most profound effects of the Anthropocene being spewed out into the environment. But nonetheless, there is a very widespread acidification of the planet, an urban form of life that is definitely causing many of these problems. 45 years of environmental protection in much of the advanced industrial world also has unfolded, ironically, with the most rapid growth of the world economy, energy use, atmospheric CO2 concentrations in human history. So at the same time that there is a heightened awareness of ecological crises, behind that discussion of a heightened worry about ecological awareness is exactly when so much tremendous economic growth has taken place, which has only made it that much worse. So I think we need to ask to what extent the Anthropocene can truly become a new call for action to help organize a better, more rational, more humane, more survivable sort of environment, or to what extent it is just the mystification of the deepest rupture in the global environment that we have ever experienced, as well as, given that so much of it has happened since, say, the end of World War II, an example of the failed Americanization of the world. And I think I'll stop a little early there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to start by taking a second to acknowledge that we are on unceded Mi'kmaq territory. The maritime provinces, all the way over to the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec, is Mi'kmaq, and the land or its resources were never officially signed over to colonial governments. And I mention this because it's important when considering the how and the who of environmental impacts. 2 years ago, David Suzuki made headlines when he declared that environmentalism has failed. Why did he say that? He's not just an old, cantankerous, bitter man, although he might be. He's been doing environmental education for 40 years and nothing's really changed. But how did we get to the point where we're on track for 6 degrees of global warming? How did it happen that a region in Alberta the size of England now looks like Mordor? The Anthropocene is defined by human activity, yet we seem unable to control our own actions. So, how did we get here? The issues are not new, which is exactly why David Suzuki is pissed off. Even climate change we've known about for decades, and we've known about what causes it for decades. And it's not like we haven't been talking. The UN has gathered countries together every year to work on it, but they've been meeting since 1992, yet emissions have only increased. So if we know about the problems, and people are talking, especially climate scientists and the leaders of countries, why has nothing changed? When I was taking environmental science classes, I couldn't figure this out. Often reading and studying about these issues, it seemed so illogical that they keep happening or that they're even getting worse. It seemed like the whole system was broken. But the fact is that climate change or other forms of destruction, rising numbers of extinct species, polluted waterways, none of these happen by accident. Environmental degradation doesn't occur by chance. It's because the system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as it's supposed to. Our economic system, that is capitalism, is based on profit and exploitation at all costs to keep generating profit. All these problems we're learning about didn't just happen by fluke. It's not like BP was drilling in the Gulf of Mexico and just coincidentally chose the cheapest materials for their wells and then forgot to run any tests and then forgot to train their staff on safety. This keeps happening. Take the Lac Mégantic explosion last summer, where a train carrying crude oil was left unattended and derailed, or the collapse of a garment factory in Bangladesh last year, or the natural gas pipeline that exploded in Manitoba on Monday. Capitalism demands ever-increasing profit, so companies are forced to save a buck any way they can, by cutting staff and wages, working conditions, or safety regulations. This is why climate change is accelerating. Companies and governments have every incentive in the world to extract more, to emit more, and to pollute more. That is, to carry on business as usual. For every environmental problem, we need to ask ourselves, who is doing this? Who is impacted? And who benefits? As Tim mentioned, who pays? This has been the environmental movement's greatest downfall. We failed to ask these key questions that get at the root of environmental pollution. The first real environmental action was the first Earth Day in 1970, a celebration of environmental education. But what that means is that we've had 43 years of Earth Days. So what has been the impact? Sure, it raised awareness and educated some people, but were any of the environmental problems solved? In fact, what has been the overall progress of the environmental movement in the last 4 decades? I would say very little, because we didn't ask who pays and who benefits. If you don't ask these questions, you get a very different picture. In that sense, climate change is a result of greenhouse gas emissions, so we just need to reduce those emissions. Well, what emits greenhouse gases? Just about everything we do. So then it follows that everybody needs to reduce their impacts and choose more environmentally friendly options. We need to change our lifestyles. And so to do that, we go and we buy organic veggies from the market, and we hang our clothes out to dry instead of using the dryer, and we tell our parents to eat less meat, which of course doesn't work, trust me. But who can afford to do that? This relegates environmentalism to the wealthy. And more importantly, what does it actually accomplish? Does anyone really believe that we'll stop the planet from burning by changing our light bulbs? Climate change is not just the amalgamation of individual actions. Even if everyone did everything they could to minimize their impact, it would be a drop in the bucket for what's needed. Despite the popularity of buying green and lowering our carbon footprint, the tar sands continue to grow bigger and produce more oil. The rallying cry of the environmental movement is save the planet. Do this, but don't buy that to save the planet. But the Earth isn't dying. The Earth is being killed, and those who are killing it have names and addresses. What that means is that raising awareness and promoting individual choices are important, but they're just not nearly enough. We always have to ask who is doing this and why, and who benefits. Our economic system means that people are driven to put profit over all else, even the biosphere we depend on. So, if the environmental movement has failed, it's for the best. Climate change isn't a scientific problem. There is global consensus on what causes climate change. It's not even a technical problem. The solutions exist, we just choose not to implement them. No, it's a political problem. Corporations and many governments have a vested interest in the status quo. That's why the federal government gives $1.4 billion in subsidies to the tar sands companies every year. We're giving $1.5 billion to the richest industry in the planet per year. That's completely illogical and insane by any standard other than in capitalism. Since climate change is a political problem, how do we create change? We can't talk or buy our way out of climate chaos, so what can we do? The environmental movement failed because it isn't radical. That is, using the real meaning of the word, it doesn't get to the root of the problem. Where environmentalism has failed, other more inclusive movements have risen, like the environmental justice and the climate justice movements that try to recognize that being apolitical means to accept the status quo. It means overlooking the root. If we're going to create real change, our movements need to be radical, that is, getting to the root, and based on justice. Environmental justice makes explicit that population and environmental degradation are predicated upon other forms of inequality, like class and race. Who is most affected by environmental destruction in Canada? Our economy is based off natural resources, which are mostly on Indigenous land. So it's no coincidence that Native communities downstream from the tar sands have high rates of rare cancers. Or, to put it more locally, why are landfills and toxic waste almost exclusively located near Indigenous or African Nova Scotian communities? 30% of African Nova Scotians live within 5 kilometers of a dump. Lincolnville, a small African Nova Scotian community of 9,000, has 2 dumps. The last one opened in 2006. This isn't an accident. For climate change, this means not only asking who emits the most carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases, but who has emitted the most historically. Which countries emit the most per person? Which countries have the capacity, the resources, and the technology to lower emissions? This is exactly what climate justice asks. Climate justice highlights that countries that have done the least to cause climate change are the very ones bearing the biggest impacts. Justice demands that the rich and historically responsible countries do more than the poor to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Environmental justice and climate justice mean taking an honest look at how impacts happen, who is impacted, and who causes them. So, at this point, if there's like a good news and bad news part of my talk, the bad news is that these problems are all far more complicated than we thought and we've been told. But the good news is that our economic system is ridiculous. All it takes sometimes, bear with me, all it takes sometimes is just pointing that out. Some of the most effective activism just highlights the absurdity of the situation. Like last fall, when 7 world-class libraries for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans were closed, and most of the records were chucked out or burned. Our government was burning books. What are we, the Catholic Church in the 16th century? It doesn't make any sense. And when you point it out, people come together and rally. As a member of Divest Dalhousie, this is exactly what we're doing. It doesn't make any sense for a university, especially one like Dalhousie that builds its reputation on sustainability, to invest in the fossil fuel industry. Does it make sense for them to invest in the very industries that are destroying the planet? We know that to keep warming under 2 degrees, we need to keep 2/3 of fossil fuel reserves in the ground. Companies aren't just going to leave them there. So we're showing the absurdity of the situation and presenting an alternative. Taking away the financial incentive and investing in alternatives like renewables or retrofits, for example. And it's working. The Dalhousie Student Union recently voted unanimously to support divestment at Dal, and we're meeting with the Board of Governors. When we talk about actions that cut to the core and hit to the root and show the absurdity, one of the best actions I've seen is at the United Nations climate change process. There's an organization called the Yes Men, who are very famous for stunts and hoaxes. And a couple of years back, they impersonated the Canadian government. They put up a fake website that looked exactly like Environment Canada right before the Copenhagen summit and said that Canada was radically changing our climate strategy and actually going to commit to major reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And, of course, this wasn't the case. The Canadian government had to come out and call them liars and say that, no, actually, we don't care enough to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. When I was at COP17, the United Nations climate negotiations, we also, a group of us from the Canadian Youth Delegation, made little balls out of molasses and dirt and called them bitumen balls, and gave them out wearing the Canadian flag to people coming in to show and highlight what the Canadian government was doing there. The Canadian government was there to obstruct progress and promote the tar sands. Later, in the plenary, when Canada and the Environment Minister got up to speak, a number of us got up and turned our backs on his address, wearing shirts that said, "People before profits," and "Turn your back on Canada." We were escorted out and lost accreditation, but it sent a clear message saying that what the absurdity of the situation was. And I'm out of time? Okay. I'll just say that change happens by showing the contradictions of capitalism and pointing to viable alternatives. These are just a couple of examples of how to transform society, but the possibilities are endless. Thank you.
First of all, I would also like to thank the organizers who've been very kind in inviting me here. I'm most pleased to be on such a wonderful panel and to have an opportunity to speak to students at Dalhousie. I'm just off strike. Our strike ended about an hour ago, so I'm pleased to say that I'm getting paid again. I want to take a little bit of a different tack. And it's a tack that I'm embarrassed to say it doesn't have the kind of political content that the previous two speakers had, and I'm aware of that and somewhat embarrassed by it. But here we go. My own research it has, in part anyway, had to do with the relationship between First Nations peoples and their struggles for justice and the left, specifically looking at Marxist parties. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to start with a brief statement about the nature of modernity, and then speak about First Nations and their politics and their particular unique understanding and what they can bring to this kind of discussion about the Anthropocene. My view is that the position I want for you to take away is that I think if we understand correctly and carefully and properly the manner of living of Indigenous peoples, we will see that it shows something very critical about the manner of living of those people who are not Indigenous, those people who inhabit who inhabit modernity. Modernity, in part, and there's many aspects of modernity, but modernity, in part, is based on the view that nature itself is devoid of all meaning. This originates in the philosophical position of Thomas Hobbes. I'll leave that perhaps for some questions. But the position of Hobbes is that nature itself is without meaning. The meaning that nature has, the meaning that it has to us, is the meaning that we give it through our own thinking. That it is not nature itself which has a meaning, but a meaning is imposed on it by us based on our appetites. And this is very important, that the modern, I think, understanding of what nature is that nature draws its meaning from the appetitive outlook, the appetite-based outlook that we take towards nature. So that the head of Exxon looks at the north part of Alberta and sees oil and profits. They look at a forest and they see how many dollars a board foot. They don't see a forest, they don't see living things, they don't see ecosystems, they don't see especially the kinds of specific ecologies in which real living people inhabit. They see money, in other words. The world's meaning is to them what is their appetite, and their appetite is one of money. The consequence of this is that nature is a series of resources. It is just a great big pile of resources which is to be manipulated and transformed on the basis of what is our will. So we, in the modern world, hate nature. We want to destroy it, to grind it up, to turn it into a pulp, and to reprocess it into something which looks of value to us. The example I use with my students is fast processed food. You take a piece of chicken and you grind it up into a pulp and you add kind of stuff to it, and then you shape it into what you think the customer thinks chicken looks like, and then you sell it back to them. The real thing is not respected. The real thing is not loved. In fact, it's despised. Nature is there to be transformed by us to suit our purposes. It itself, in itself, has no meaning and no value. And as I said, this, I believe, originates in Hobbes, but Hobbes being one of the founders of bourgeois society. Standing in opposition to this is the way that First Nations peoples have traditionally lived. And they stand outside the modern paradigm, and the study of First Nations and their manner of living, I think, is valuable to us as we try to grapple with the perversities and destructive qualities of modernity. Freedom for First Nations peoples in their traditional life does not mean transforming nature to suit their purposes. It means living on nature, as Marx famously says in the 1844 manuscripts. But in addition to living on nature, it also means living under nature and with nature and through nature and around it. In other words, it means being sensitive to the real true meaning of each specific ecology, of each individual specific ecological moment, each ecological space. It means being sensitive to that and to forming a manner of living with that world, with that ecology, around it, through it, not in competition with it, not in destruction of it, but in cooperation with it, to see what that ecology is telling us about how we should live. There is no private property. They don't have private property. They don't have what we would call fee simple, where as the owner of the property you can do with it as you please. First Nations traditionally had a system which we would call usufruct, where one can make use of what nature has to offer, what the specific ecology makes available to us, but one does not have the right to own and destroy and transform and to reshape nature into our image. We have, I would argue, adopted the standpoint of God in our attitude towards the world. And it is not an attitude, we are in a sense godlike in that we can create and destroy the world as we see fit. And this is not a properly human attitude to take towards nature, and it is not one which First Nations people have taken towards it. And I think there's, as I said, there's much that can be learned from it. One example I will give, and then I will leave it to there. In the Iroquois tradition, whenever there is a meeting, for example, of this kind, where serious people are going to debate and think about serious issues, where truth-telling in its most profound is what is required, they refuse to begin any meeting of this kind without offering a thanksgiving. It is in their, as we would call it, their constitution, the great law of peace. This Thanksgiving, I have had the pleasure to witness it a few times, is a long Thanksgiving. It goes on a half an hour or an hour. And what is thanked are all the aspects of nature which make our life possible. They do not think that it is possible to begin any serious deliberation without a clear recognition of all of the grounds of our human being in the natural world. And I think if we imagine what our politicians thank as they begin their deliberations about funding oil companies and pipelines and so on. Well, this is a talk, at least in part, about Marxism and the left, and so I want to just finish with that. I have written in the past and do believe very strongly that there is much that the left in general, and specifically the Marxist left, can learn from First Nations. The relationship has not in the past been a good one, in part because significant aspects of the left have committed themselves to the project of modernity, the project of de-ontologizing nature, of stripping it of its own meaning, of transforming nature, of using it as a resource, even if a sustainable resource, but using it as a resource which is to serve simply human purposes. And insofar as the left has committed itself to that project, which it has significantly, they have not found themselves on good terms with First Nations. And it has always been for me a litmus test of the progress which the left needs to make, that it find itself allied with the First Nations. And so I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll also echo the thanks to the organizers. It's great to be here in Halifax. To get out of the valley for an evening. So the worry about going last on a panel like this is it'll come to me and everything I want to say has already been said. I kind of feel a little bit like that, actually. The nice thing, though, is that I get the extra unused time, right? Okay, so I want to start with an observation that I'm going to guess most, if not everybody in this room, has already heard at some point. Which is that the words economy and ecology share a common etymological root. They both come from the Greek word oikos, which means home. As I said, that connection between economy and ecology is one that's often made. But I want to highlight that those two terms are connected through this idea of home, because that's a theme that I'm going to come back to over the next 11 and a half minutes. Because I think the task for us today in the Anthropocene involves thinking about the Anthropocene as a kind of homemaking. I think it's difficult for us to think about planetary change in terms of homemaking because of the scale of the enterprise of the human species. The geological transformations which are happening, and things that geological scientists like to call deep time, so like the rest of us are just kind of working in the shallows. Deep time or geological time scales relate to human time scales, I think, in kind of analogous ways to the ways in which the sort of human scale of household budgets, how much am I making this month, how much is my rent, do I have enough money to go out for beers on Saturday night, the scale of those kinds of questions relates to the financial scale of global capitalism. For example, the fact that roughly $2 trillion worth of currency trading happens every single day. So very different kinds of scales. So let me just lay out a few of the contours of the current era. As others have mentioned, largely because of anthropogenic emissions, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are at 400 parts per million. The last time they were there at that level was about 3 million years ago. And at that time, the planet was 8 degrees warmer, and sea levels were 15 to 25 meters higher. Right? I don't know how high above sea level we are right at this moment. I know that my office and my house in Wolfville are not too much more than 25 meters above sea level. But the Anthropocene is not just about climate, it's about the nature of the planetary surface and subsurface itself. So, according to a 2012 study done by the World Bank, global municipal solid waste production is 1.3 billion tons per year, projected to grow to 2.2 billion tons per year by the year 2025. That's a lot of garbage. That's a lot of stuff that gets moved from one place to another. But actually, in global geological terms, that isn't particularly significant. Maybe more significant, about 1/3 of the world's land surface is now used for agriculture. 1/3 of the world's land surface has been transformed to grow corn, to raise cattle, and so on. But even with those kinds of figures, we're still just, in a way, scratching the surface. 1/2 of global wetlands have been drained, and most of the world's major rivers have been dammed. In some cases, the reservoirs produced by dams are heavy enough, and if you remember that 1 cubic meter of water, if I'm not worried about this table, I can sort of, 1 cubic meter of water weighs 1 ton. So just the creation of those reservoirs in some places has been created enough mass to noticeably affect tectonic plates, right, and cause earthquakes. Human beings now move more sediment than natural or non-anthropogenic erosion and river flows. And according to one estimate in Nature, a very respected scientific journal in 2005, human activities shift 10 times as much material on the Earth's surface as all natural geological processes or non-human geological processes put together. And in fact, the anthropogenic or human-produced movement of stuff around the Earth surpassed non-anthropogenic movement about 1,000 years ago. So the Anthropocene, in a way, is not really new. We're just kind of discovering it. With those kinds of figures in mind, I think it becomes apparent that terms like environmental impact, ecological footprint, are not really adequate metaphors for what's happening. They misrecognize the scale of human activity. We have to move from thinking about human activity as a kind of tinkering at the margins of the planetary system, moving the furniture around in the house a little bit, to thinking about human activity as fundamentally reshaping the planetary system. Obviously, there are negative implications to the way in which our planetary system has been and is being reshaped, a kind of litany of ecological effects, which other people have talked about. The devastation around the Alberta tar sands is one. The production of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is another. These kinds of things are often talked about in negative terms for very good reason. But it's also possible, and I think even necessary, to think about it in more positive terms as well. Human beings, like all species, engage in a process of constructing a niche for themselves, or for ourselves, right? In that sense, we're just like beavers who build dams, we're just like ants or bees. And what the term Anthropocene denotes, or what it signifies, is a shift in that process of niche construction to the planetary scale. So we're now making the whole planet Earth, in other words, into our home. So the question that was raised at the beginning about whether the Anthropocene is a growth or a narrowing of human potential, I think the answer is yes. We have to think about the Anthropocene simultaneously in terms of catastrophe and progress. And in order to do that, we need to think about the Anthropocene through the question of who or what is man, or what is the anthropos in the Anthropocene. So the kind of who-whom question that Tim raised, or who pays and who benefits, as James said. So let me turn to 3 ways in which I think we can and should think about, question, problematize the anthropos. So the first is that not all members of the species Homo sapiens are equally responsible as movers and shapers of the earth. Feminism provides a very useful reminder that when we use the term man, we're not always using it to apply to all people. Or as the cyberpunk author William Gibson once put it, the future is here, it just isn't very evenly distributed. So, there's a lot of talk about the 1%. I'm not going to talk about the 1%. I'll talk first about the wealthiest 10% of the world's population, which probably includes some people in this room, maybe including me. The wealthiest 10% of the world's population is responsible for about 60% of global consumption. So that's the top 10%. Some of you may have seen an item that came out, I think, a week or 2 ago about the 85 richest individuals in the world. So that's the top, I got to count the zeros here, 0.0000001% of the world's population owns as much as the bottom 50%. Okay, so 85 people own as much as half of the world's population. This may be a point that's familiar to people, or at least to some people, but it's one that needs to be emphasized when responsibility for environmental change or environmental degradation is laid at the feet of human beings, or when the impetus for environmental action is framed in terms of, to quote High School Musical, sorry, I have a 12-year-old daughter, we're all in this together. I would do the dance too, but Steve filmed and
we pay.
Yeah, sure. So teasing out responsibility for anthropogenic change among different individual and also collective actors is, I think, the first important task. If the first task is about the degree to which members of the Anthropos share common characteristics in terms of their role and power in shaping the earth or reshaping the earth, the second has to do with the degree to which the Anthropos is aware of itself as a collective agent. In the early 1990s, before people settled on the term Anthropocene, Andrew Refkin was looking at the same kinds of ecological trends and suggested the term Anthropocene, so just without the PO. So here's a quote from an article of his. 2 billion years ago, cyanobacteria oxygenated the atmosphere and powerfully disrupted life on Earth, but they didn't know it. We're the first species that's become a planet-scale influence and is aware of that's reality. That's what distinguishes us. End quote. Well, I think yes and no. To be sure, we are increasingly aware of humanity's role in reshaping the planet, but at the same time, this awareness hasn't translated into a kind of reflexive or self-conscious agency, or sense of agency. Most of the human actions that are reshaping the planet are a result of decisions made, as it were, behind people's backs, or unconsciously. Decisions about what gets put where, how, by whom, are generally not made by people thinking about what kind of planet are we creating, but rather by people who are thinking about more immediate concerns. How am I going to get to work today? What should I have for supper? How can I keep my supervisor, my employer, my constituents, or my shareholders happy? In a society like ours, it's largely what Adam Smith called the invisible hand, the naturalized laws of supply and demand, that determine prices, wages, levels of production, what gets extracted, what gets built, what gets dumped, where, how, and so on. In short, how the social and natural worlds are reshaped. And this is to a great extent what's happening in the Anthropocene. We're doing things that are shaping and reshaping quite profoundly our ecological niche, but awareness of that reshaping isn't what's guiding our actions. And our current political and economic structures make us largely incapable of reshaping the world as a conscious process of home building. So the third and final challenge is a challenge of a different sort. I think we could think of solving the first two challenges, making the planet a home for Homo sapiens, as a kind of culmination of humanism. But one of the things that I think is quite striking about the current moment is that at the same time as we're talking more and more about the Anthropocene, there's been a push from environmentalists, among others, to move beyond humanism. So this third point challenges us to give some further pause before answering what is the Anthropos, or homemaking by whom and for whom. What does it do to our conceptions of human subjectivity and human agency to note that each of us has an incredibly biodiverse environment, trillions of bacteria, about 5 pounds worth, right inside of our guts? To think of human beings as serving the reproductive needs of companion species outside of our bodies, cows, pigs, corn, rice, dogs, and so on. Maybe we're serving them as much as they're serving us. It's an unusual thought, but I have a dog, and I know that I pick up the dog's shit. She doesn't pick up mine. Or to ask who or what is really the agent that compels my hand, and maybe this has happened to many of you as well, compels my hand to go again, mindlessly, back into the bag of Doritos for another chip, again and again, without any kind of conscious thought. Okay, so from Doritos to Immanuel Kant. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant says the interests of reason are to be found in 3 questions. What can we know? What ought we to do? What may we hope? Kant actually says I instead of we, but make it we. So epistemological limits, normative guidelines for actions, grounds for transcendent faith. First, the question, who or what is man, what is the Anthropos, is a political question, and because it's a political question, it can never be finally settled. The principles of humanism, tempered by an awareness of the ambiguity of the human, provide at least a first approximation, I think, of how we should act. And finally, since I'm out of time, what may we hope? In a famous aphorism, Walter Benjamin, a philosopher from the early 20th century, wrote that the task of the present, writing in the 1920s, but it still applies, is to achieve, quote, not the mastery of nature, but mastery of the relation between nature and man. And I think mastering this relation would mean working towards making the planet a place where we can be at home. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks to our speakers for staying right on time. I think what we're going to do is we're going to take 2 questions, and then we'll go take 3 questions. In this first round of questions, I'll also give the panelists a chance to respond to one another. So maybe, and I'm going to prioritize students, as is the tradition in this lecture series. So, does anybody have any questions to start with? I think, there's one right at the back. Do you ever have a microphone?
We do.
Okay, so you're going to have to speak up right in the back corner to start with, and then to you.
Timothy said that urban forms of life were the creation of emission-based problems, but people occupying urban centers are often more left-leaning, and New York City has really low emissions per capita. Do you think that it could also be the solution? Urban life.
Do you understand the question? Okay, and then there's another. Okay, so just to repeat the question. So, because I didn't quite understand the question. So, if I understood correctly, that Tim had said that people in urban areas are more of that problem is being created in urban centers. But you see, you wonder about the contrary. It seems like urban living is a much more efficient way of living. Is that correct?
Sure.
Okay, so that is one of the questions. If I missed anything, speak up now. Okay, and then there was another question right towards the back. There we go.
Well, should they answer that question first?
No, we're going to take 2, and I'll keep track of them. So, yeah, go ahead. Loud, too.
Okay, I guess this was specifically for James Hutt, but I'll comment on it. I like the idea that environmentalism has failed because it's not radical enough. But considering groups like the Environmental Liberation Front, like how far is, say, too far in terms of like eco-terrorism? Like where would you even think is unnecessary to draw the line?
Great question. So this question was to what extent, obviously it needs to be more radical, but how radical is it? Eco-terrorism? Like how would James sort of like think about what would be adequate? What kind of radicalism would be adequate for the task? So maybe we'll start in the same order, and you can also respond to one another at this point.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very good question about the nature of urbanization or citification. What I'm talking about is just sort of the global citification of the Earth, that when we hit 50%, 60%, 70% of the Earth being urbanized in an urban area, that has a great impact on the environment in as much as we're moving, as Andrew noted, so much material from one place into those cities. How that city is structured has, to me, been always an important environmental issue. Compact, densely settled, well-planned cities are in many ways far more ecologically sensible and efficient than automotive sprawl that goes 70 or 80 miles off in a one-dimensional sort of way. One answer to the struggle of environmentalism in terms of its radical quality, and one reason why environmentalism often is not seen as radical, is in many ways environmentalism has been trying to find ways to make on the margins whatever qualities of the accidental normality of industrialization as having less impact. And I've sort of written about this, basically calling it a system of sustainable degradation, that we're continually degrading the environment, but how can we do it sustainably? A radical change would be utterly reimagining the urban form, utterly reimagining how cities are made, which would challenge our tastes about housing, about transportation, about land use, about where places of labor are versus places of consumption. Proposals have been made for that for over a century on restructuring the urban form, and they're usually utterly ignored because they're seen as too radical. So you don't have to be in the Earth Liberation Front to be considered an ecological radical. You can just come up with an idea of the city as a megastructure that takes up far less space and be considered a kind of crackpot or an interesting designer, both of which sort of lead to no change and continuing ecological degradation.
For the first question about environmental living being more efficient, I would say that's really not the question to be asking, because no matter how efficient we are, it doesn't change the nature of climate change, it doesn't change the nature of what causes climate change. We've been becoming more and more efficient over the last 2 decades, but yet environmental destruction and runaway climate change has only accelerated. So, again, let's get to the root. And 2, in terms of the second question, where do we draw the line, or where do we become in terms of radical environmentalism? Well, I think first we need to consider what that means, and it's got very different definitions. The previous environment minister called anyone who opposed Keystone XL and Northern Gateway environmental radicals. So probably almost everyone in this room is an environmental radical. But what radical means is to get to the root. So when we're thinking about actions, we're thinking about strategies, how do we actually get to that root? And what are we doing to show the contradictions of capitalism? And does it present alternatives? What are our strategic goals? And as Tim mentioned, a lot of things that might seem that's labeled as radical, such as the Earth Liberation Front, such as sabotage, is really just attacking the end goal. It's attacking the symptom rather than the cause. But I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. But what I think the activism that I hear to and the activism that I think makes the most sense is one that shows the contradictions while presenting actual alternatives. And I think the most fun way I've seen this done is with the Reclaim the Streets movement that got massive amounts of people together to re-envision what actually happens in our streets. And so instead of driving with cars, you had thousands of people organizing random dance parties or bringing potted plants and making a park on a freeway and just rethinking that and presenting those 2 options.
I guess I have the same kind of answer for both questions, which is kind of curious, and it gets back to my talk where I embarrassingly didn't speak enough about politics. I'm going to remedy that now. Urbanization is a symptom of a particular form of property ownership and poverty on a mass scale. We don't have people crowding into these megacities because they find urban life pleasant. They go there because they've been driven off the land, which is how the capitalism began in the first place. The urbanization of the world is a function of capitalism and gross inequities in wealth. The solution to urbanization is a political one. Certainly when you say about radical or not radical environmentalism, environmentalism is not to be solved. The environmental problem is not to be solved by environmentalism. It has to have a political solution. And so environmental problems require solutions which are environmental but grounded in politics. So the radical quality to it is in the political side, not on the whether you blow things up or not. Just as an aside, to show you how sometimes, I don't know why I find this funny, but I show it to my students. The napkins that you get in our cafeteria have a stamp on them which says, because they're brown, because brown paper looks like it's more environmentally friendly. It says, saving the planet, one napkin at a time. So if you all just use that napkins, then we're in good order. That's funny.
Yeah, those are great questions. A lot of my answers, I think, have already been said. I think the question about urbanization is what kinds of cities we're creating, rather than urban versus rural, something like that. And the question about radicalism, I think it's important to be radical in terms of, as Jim said, getting to the root of the problem, thinking about what the ultimate goal of the movement is. I also think, we have to think about this as a collective project for human beings, and in that sense, it's not going to be solved by just a few people blowing stuff up or whatever. It does mean that, maybe some people doing that is part of kind of diversity of tactics, but it requires also a lot of other people doing other kinds of things to bring along the people who are not as aware of the issues, not as engaged with the issues, and so on.
Can I add one small point to that? I'll just say that I think perhaps a better word instead of radical is traditional. When we talk about activism, thinking about what are the traditional or formal channels that activism takes. And I mean, what I mean by that is no one really thinks that writing Harper a letter and telling him to shut down the tar sands is going to work. And an extension of that is voting and traditional political channels often and do fail. And so when they do, we shouldn't be limited to that. The imagination has no end, neither should our activism. And so taking to the streets or civil disobedience in terms of marches or stuff like that, or nonviolent resistance, as it worked in the civil rights movement, can work again.
Great. More questions? Okay. So I'm going to prioritize the students first. Are there any students with questions? Okay. All right. Omri? Go ahead, Omri. First. No mic, so you have to speak up now.
So a lot of the panelists talked about modernity as sort of, and I guess the topic of the lecture tonight is the Anthropocene. But modernity as this key point where we diverged from this perhaps more idyllic form of nature at this time when human beings were more in sync with our natural environment and more capable of having a non-exploitative relationship with both each other and the environment. I think that given the representation that's on this panel, which is, to be fair, visibly white men, it's important for us to acknowledge that at the same time that modernity started to exploit nature and started to exploit the environment around us, women were also part of that exploitation. The voices of women in traditional communities were often taken away as the first step towards destroying those communities and allowing for the process of urbanization to happen. So, for instance, in Britain with the enclosure movement, we know that a lot of the enclosures that happened started with women and with witch burning. And so, how do we, in this panel, and more specifically, how do you folks who are on the panel hope to address this historic sort of process that happened in Canada, both the exploitation of our natural environment, but also that happening in Canada with women's voices being diminished in our communities?
Good question. So the question, the problem of modernity and people who have sort of have been left out of modernity and sort of been exploited, and specifically with respect to how women and houses as a panel sort of respond to that specific dimension of it, which seems very bound up with that transition. Any other questions? I'm trying to take 3 here. Okay, I'll take there, and is there any other students? Got any questions? Okay. Well, we'll go there to start with, and then we'll go off to the right.
Just first of all, why has nobody mentioned I don't know more? Just as an aside, number one. But also, I want to ask about movements such as transition towns, which are sort of pre-political or prefigurative, the occupying movement, transition towns, are prefigurative movements that move from industries relocalizing goods and services produced by and used by the people that are going to use them. So it's an anti-globalization movement that is about relocalization of food, energy, goods and services within the ecosystem that you are living in. Okay, so it's pre-political and it hasn't really taken a political stance yet, but at its core is a sharing economy that is anti-profit and anti-capitalist.
Okay, great. And so the question, prefiguration in terms of something like transitional towns, where sort of a local system sort of prefigures how a new system could take.
A new political system would come out of that.
Right, as pre-political but emerging. And I'm going to just do a question right at the back, so we'll go there and then.
Yeah, just to elaborate on too, I hope in answering that question, if you could speak at all to the potential conflict between these sort of localization movements and imperialism, because so much of this sort of like, oh, we're going to transition, is founded on technology that's based fundamentally on like rare earth metals and resources stolen from the third world at that point. And if you could sort of address that apparent contradiction.
Okay, so there's the question about imperialism and localism. There seems to be a way in which it doesn't take into account these dimensions of like projected power. In some ways, Henri's question sort of ties in again with groups that sort of fall out of modernity. So we want to start with these three questions. James?
Sure. I'd say that it's only very recently that the environmental movement has gained mainstream attention, and let alone like mass activism. And that's because one of the ways that we've understood nature has been to be very external to us. And so fitting within that in an apolitical frame, the actions we can take are about individual choices, and they're about consumer relations. They're about market relations. And so that relegates it to privilege. It relegates it to often wealthy, white, upper-middle-class, college-educated people, which, as a man, a white-educated, college-educated man on a panel of men, I recognize. And that's something that we've struggled with, that the environmental movement has struggled with, and has failed partly because of that. And so when we talk about rising movements of climate justice or environmental justice, it's about recognizing that often the people who've done the least to cause these problems, environmental problems or climate change, are the most affected. And the caveat to that, or the corollary, is that they should be the ones leading the fight. They know the struggle, they have the knowledge, and so it opens up larger questions of privilege. I don't have time to really get into the nuts and bolts of it, but opening up the whole question of privilege and who has privilege in terms of the environmental movement has left it a very undiverse movement. And so seeking to change that, we look at movements like Idle No More, movements that take the people who are the most affected and take leadership from that. And in terms of prefigurative politics and kind of reimagining that relationship, I would argue that, well, to link the last two questions, I would say that to the extent that it tries to be apolitical or tries to be pre-political or apolitical at the core, then it has those contradictions and then it fails. But to the extent where it recognizes that it is political, because everything is political, then it can overcome those contradictions of mining from cell phone materials in parts of Africa or anything like that. It's about recognizing that everything we do is political, and so if we're going to present solutions, first we have to present the contradictions in capitalism and actually move towards these reimagining of our relationships that don't depend on capital, that don't depend on the market. I think I'll leave it there.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. For the first question, I agree that the exploitation of nature goes hand in hand with the exploitation of other humans, and that's gendered but also racialized to connect to the point about imperialism. I think modernity is a kind of double-edged thing, right? That it has this aspect of domination, of exploitation, but also a kind of project of freedom. And the trick is to develop a kind of immanent critique of what's going on, right? To be able to realize the values of modernity in ways that they haven't been fully realized because the domination has been projected out onto nature and onto non-human others. The other two questions, I guess, because they're connected. I mean, the transition towns is a great example, and sharing economy, obviously, something that's important to look at as a kind of prefigurative alternative to something different. I guess in a way, the third question is part of my response to the second question, because you mentioned, the transition town movement is about living within the ecosystem that you're living, but I think none of us really live within ecosystems at that local scale anymore, right? Like the ecosystem now that we live in is global, like it or not, right? In a way that the time for that kind of relocalization, that's a ship that sailed, right? We're altering the planet now, and we have no choice, I think, but to think in global terms.
I just want to address, if I could, just briefly the question on cooperatives and local forms. There, of course, has been a long tradition of cooperatives and alternative forms of living, various kinds of dropping out, and so on. And they are inspiring in many ways, both from the dedication of the people who are involved and in the enormous creativity which goes into it, and the wonderful examples of how people can live in ways which are not exploitative and do live within the context of the local ecology. The difficulty is the following, and it's a difficulty which First Nations people face all the time in their struggle, and that is, if you sit down with a blackboard and write friends and enemies, who are the people who will support the First Nations in their struggle, and who are the ones who are against it, there's a very long list on the side against, and there's not much on the side for. Students, ecological activists, some church groups, and so on, a few intellectuals, the list is not great, and what it really lacks is any form of social power. And you can speak in truthfully and valuably about the fact that these kinds of social movements can be pre-political, and that a political form will emerge out of it. But the reality is that nothing will emerge out of it unless there is the social weight behind these movements to counter capital. Otherwise, they're just hippie communes, as beautiful as those things are. And when you do the counting up of who are the friends and who are the enemies, there's a whole bunch on the enemy side who will never change. And the one which is not, which is up for grabs, is labor. That is the only group that I've been able to come up with, which is currently perhaps not necessarily on the side of local ecologies and cooperatives and First Nations and so on, but which could be. And they could be with the proper kind of education. And I don't mean to say that we have to educate the working class, but I mean the kind of self-empowerment and so on of the working class on its own. But in the absence of that kind of alliance, the politics are all lined up against it, and it remains a beautiful, small local examples, and nothing more than that.
Yeah, sure. These are really good questions. Andrew brought out the point that the connection between the oikos, the household, and ecology, that we have two homes, a home of native, sort of a second nature or built environments, cities, settlements, and that of nature. It does appear, the argument can be made quite convincingly that the domination within the household of males, of the old, of the warriors over those who do not war, the young and female, is a power formation that definitely is found throughout much of history, and that the domination of people is in some respects antecedent to the domination of nature, and that the two go hand in hand. By the same token, modernity is a problem, but some folks would say that these anthropogenic changes that we've been talking about really begin back 5,000-6,000 years with the Neolithic Revolution, the emergence of cities, where you actually have cities emerging as machines that concentrate, cultivate energy through agriculture, and in doing so create states, and in doing so create war machines, and in doing so begin to create some of the deleterious ecological effects that we're worried about. Yet at the same time, ironically, this rise of cities creates civilization, so that much of what is regarded as the highest aspects of humanity emerges out of cities, just as many of these destructive ecological impacts come out of the way cities are organized. So one has to realize that it is, as Andrew mentioned, a double-edged sword. I'm apprehensive about, and I see the merit of transition towns, and I see the merit of local action, and these things can be prefigurative moments if they are connected into a larger political movement. An anxiety I have about them is that they are, in fact, very political, and they're political in the sense that neoliberal powers who have no interest in allowing poorer people to continue to burn a lot of oil or to have access to all kinds of food are happy to let people experiment with 18th or 19th century forms of life where they live locally, raise their own hogs, grow their own potatoes, and sit behind walls waiting for the flood to come, while at the same time they're continue to exploit the planet in a much more rapacious way. So to what extent are these forms of alternatives really a kind of eco-zoning for poor, the eco-zoning for the powerless, where you're not just writing them off totally, you're sort of leaving them to their own devices to attain the highest form of life that one could have in the 17th century, plus maybe modern medicine, while at the same time, very rich, very powerful people will live in a global way, getting anything that they want anywhere because they will have access to fossil fuels and other energies that these other people choose not to use. In that sense, I find sustainability often a dangerous kind of political discourse. I think what is being sustained for whom? Sustainability you can trace it back to something that's endurable or bearable. Can you endure living in a transition town and think you're waiting for the green future to arise? And sustainability can also mean that you have actually grabbed hold of something, you possess something, you own it, you've grabbed it, and you're going to keep it. It's not the same root as you find in tenure as it lays at sustainability. So once you got it, you're going to keep it, and if you got it, you're going to keep it, and you're going to make sure other people who don't get it aren't going to get it. So it becomes a positional good. So if you're powerful and you're rich and you have access to all the goodies, you want to keep that. And in the neoliberal economy, it's fine to have transition towns or back to the landers or community-supported agriculture, and in the meantime, behind walled compounds and enclave cities, the 21st or 22nd century gets invented, and the poor live essentially in, as Mike Davis has called it, a planet of slums.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think there was a question right at the back. Dan, still here?
I had one.
Okay. I'll just take the students and then I'll go to you.
I was just wondering, to what extent do you think that principles of ecology can be applied socially, considering that in an ecosystem there is no hierarchy of like one animal being more important than another, everything kind of works together and is interconnected, and whether you see any potential in a sustainable future in using ecological principles
that into sort of into thinking about how society can be reconfigured in maybe in the ways that we were talking about breaking down these divisions between nature and society. How could these things be brought together? That's a great question. Okay, so this gentleman's impatient.
Yes, I was just curious as to how we were to understand the use of the word freedom in the title of the lecture. And has the elephant come and left the room, or has he not been invited in yet? And why have we not really focused on what we mean by this?
Thank you.
Because what are we talking about?
That's a great question, because I think in a number of ways, I think it would be good to have it, because I think there's what does free development mean? Because I do think it's been, and then also when we're talking, I think the very first question that came from the back corner about, I think one thing that got left off that question was the question of urban centers being part where the left is. So if urban areas are places where this kind of freedom thinking sort of emerges, how do we connect that maybe with what David said, where it seems like the more radical elements don't exist there? How do the panel sort of think about that? Is there another student who has a question? Okay, right there.
This comes in relation to what Professor Bedford said about being godlike over nature. I think the success of humanity has been based fundamentally on our ability to manipulate nature for our means. I'm just curious, at what point do you distinguish between just manipulating nature and being godlike over it? And is it really possible to have one without the other?
Great. So, okay, that's a great question. So, the question is, how can one sort of have this? Maybe just one more time. I'm also my brain sort of.
How can we have the ability to manipulate and use that ability to manipulate nature without feeling some level of control over it?
Right. And we have to. So, if one has to manipulate nature, how do you do it in a way that's not dominating? Mm-hmm. I think it's very good, and it connects with the first question really well. Okay. Anybody want to pick up on this?
All right, I'll start because you asked me. I think the difference is the following. Where I live in Fredericton, it used to be an apple orchard. And when they built the subdivision, they plowed everything up. They cut all the trees down. They turned everything into mush. And then they built houses and planted trees around it. The alternative is to, the alternative does require use of nature. It requires some transformation of nature. But it doesn't involve the reprocessing of nature in the image of our own appetite. It is using nature as it presents itself to us. And I think that's fundamentally different. I'll let other people answer, and then I can get back to something else.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I don't know if I'm ready to answer. Someone else is.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'll jump in. To the first question on to what extent can ecology provide a model for society, if I'm understanding the question correctly. In some circles, this is considered one of the latest techno fixes. Biomimicking engineering, looking at industrial ecologies as if they are natural ecologies. Many of the problems that exist in industrial society are because we have open, broken loops in the movement of energy, material, positive product, and negative byproduct. So to what extent can you rethink the way the combustion of a fuel, heat is used more than once? Byproducts are made into something productive, not destructive. There is a minimal waste of any resource when you're transforming a materiality into energy and greenhouse gases, things of that nature. Yeah, a lot of thought is going into that, and it is not something that should be ignored, because it definitely has been ignored for 250 years with this, as David mentioned, denaturalization of nature in the immediate fulfillment of our appetites, rather than working perhaps more along the lines of nature than these kinds of imposed forms of order have created. Is that going to solve all of our problems? No, but it might make things a lot easy, make some things less toxic, and at the same time create less deleterious impacts, and create them slower and have them fall on fewer people and on fewer non-humans. With regard to the question about freedom, that's kind of the big issue. To what extent is the Anthropocene a moment of in a sense, change so radical that it robs humanity of freedom, that we're no longer free to do very much because that which once made freedom possible for a few and might make freedom possible for many is being destroyed because the ecosystem upon which life depends is being destroyed? Or to what extent do we see the Anthropocene and the fact that we're creating a new geological epoch of time doesn't seem like a big motivator to me, but I guess to some people it is. And that if deep time and what happens in deep time causes us to change our ways, then what it could do is how would we most positively want to act and most freely leave an impact on the earth, on nature, on society that would allow us to become more human, more fair, more equitable, more just, less destructive to ourselves and humanity, which I think was an idea that came with the Enlightenment, that came with modernity, but has very often been forgotten or had to be saved or reclaimed from itself by these kinds of political action. I'm not convinced that cities are always necessarily left. Much of the resistance against capitalism and against industrialism often came from outside of cities when people had their property, well, actually they had their usufructuary common weal turned into commodities through the fictive reimagination of shared goods as private property, through the fictive reimagination of their everyday activity as labor for which they can be paid or from which is just stolen from them, or this fictive transfer of money for something that really shouldn't be paid for and can't be seen in money terms. That's also seen as part of modernity. The left is kind of an artifact of the 18th, 19th, maybe 20th century, and we continue to think about things in those terms. We shouldn't leave them entirely behind, but I think there are other ways of thinking about change that is emancipatory, liberatory, without being caught in these left-right categories of basically Europe between 1815 and, whatever, the First World War, in many ways, where it gets solidified. That we need to think, we can think inside those boxes, but we can think outside those boxes. And many times cities can be very conservative and they can be very protective of their own interests. So I don't see being urban as necessarily always being left. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And then the question about whether or not you can work with nature or work against nature, is that being godlike or not godlike? I think in that respect, again, it's how you see yourself working with nature, and to even divide yourself from it is sort of the first problem. If one does that, you've sort of already lost the game. Seeing yourself as part of nature, nature is part of us. We are nature. There's this myth, of the separation of nature, but that's very problematic. Along with that, I think we have to think that, and we have to bear in mind that a lot of what we've created that is not natural is us, and it has to be watched over. Native American peoples would say, well, you have to think out 7 generations if you want to protect the earth and you want to protect society. Well, after a few events of the past 50 or 60 years, like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, Daiichi, it's probably the case that the isotopes in some of those places are going to be around for about 20,000 years. So we're going to be responsible. I think we have to think about that techno-nature or non-nature for not 7 generations, but more like 700 generations. Okay, because otherwise that's going to reach out and bite us in the behind in ways that are very nasty and toxic. And those are just the first 3 of probably many comparable and worse accidents to come. So bearing that in mind is something I think that has to be there as we think about what we're free to do when we are approaching and maybe creating or steering ourselves towards an Anthropocene.
I'll just say that for Marx, what he would mean by freedom is the ability not to have to sell your labor for wages, so not to have to go to work and for a salary and trade your time for money. And he would say that the only way this is possible is in community. And that's because capitalism, the key element of it is alienation. Alienation from the product of your labor, what you do, but also alienation from everyone else around you, alienation from your community. And it forces us, capitalism, to think of each other in terms of the market, in terms of market relations. So how can we consume? And unless you're in that 85 of the richest people, I would say there's very little freedom in the Anthropocene. You don't have more potential. You would have less. Except for when we challenge capitalism and start actually working on the alternatives, start prefiguring that in ways that we reimagine our relations between our friends, our family, between the entire communities that don't depend on market and commodities of exchange. And to the extent where those principles can come from ecological principles, I'd say great, but it depends on reimagining our relations, challenging power, and thinking beyond dollars and cents.
Thanks. So the first question about applying the principles of ecology to the social world. I think we've been doing that for a very long time, actually. But what's changed is what we think the principles of ecology are, right? So in the 19th century, we had a kind of Darwinian view of this is what nature is, and that gets mirrored in the kind of dog-eat-dog capitalist economy that gets created out of that time. I think we find ourselves, or we find the social world in nature, and we find what we think nature is in our social world, and I don't think that's just a coincidence, right? I think our ideas of what nature is are deeply influenced by the kind of society or the kind of social world that we find ourselves in. And this connects to the next question, I think, about what's freedom. And freedom, I think of in terms of autonomy, right? As the capacity to make rules for oneself, or to live under rules that one has created for oneself. I think part of the problem is that we tend to think of autonomy, freedom, self-government very much in individualizing terms. And to get back to something that David said, we continue to live under the sort of tyrannical shadow of Hobbes, right, for the last 400 years. This kind of way of thinking only in terms of individual subjectivity, as you're not free unless you're free as an individual, and we really sort of lose the capacity to think about freedom in other kinds of ways. And the third question about manipulating nature versus a kind of godlike perspective, I think, that's what I think the kind of post-humanist turn is about, is trying to cultivate a kind of sense of humility and to get at that question of separation of human beings from nature that Tim was just talking about, and to see that as part of the problem, right? To not think of ourselves just as individuals, but to think of ourselves as social beings, but also not to think of ourselves as simply human, right? That there is nature inside of us, that we are constituted by not just our relations with other people, but also by our relations with non-human parts of the world as well.
Okay, thanks so much. We are coming up to, we've got just about 9 minutes left, so I thought maybe what we would do is just give the panelists a chance to wrap up. I guess one thing that I've been thinking as I've been listening to the conversation that I was wondering about is, when we think about the history of the left, there was a way in which, Andrew talks about, the subjectivity being very diffuse, but there was an idea of the working class arising from capitalism, not separate from it, and actively being able to be a force in society that would assume a form of subjectivity, and that doesn't seem to happen right now. Like, I'm wondering to what extent all these other forms of agency seem apparent to us because there simply isn't a conceivable way in which society could change. And what does that mean? But I'll let you, maybe going in reverse order, starting with Andrew. Let's go, because Andrew sort of like startled me sometime to think. Tim,
I can go first.
What's that? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe we'll go in reverse order and just wrap up on these questions.
I think I only have one other thing that I want to say that sort of got lost because I wanted to respond to a response, I think, and didn't have the opportunity. But someone at some point was talking about imagination. I can't remember now who it was. But I think that's an important kind of thing or concept to emphasize. And to go back to that question about radicalism, right? I think like the real radicalism has to be a radicalism of the imagination and a capacity to think in different ways about the opportunities that, as well as the problems or limitations that are posed by the contemporary moment. I'll just give one example, and I'll apologize to my students at Acadia, but it just happened this week. In class, we were talking about collective action. And the importance of collective action, what collective action means. And every example, as we were sort of going around the room, different people were talking, was get people out to a protest. That's we'll get people out to a protest. We'll get people out to a protest. And that's that is one kind of collective action, but it's it's only one kind, right? And if you're thinking about collective action, what we can do together is limited to getting a bunch of people out onto University Avenue or getting a bunch of people out in front of Province House or signing an online petition or something like that. That's really an impoverished kind of way of thinking about collective action. There's so many other ways in which we already can and do act together, and to think about taking those kinds of vehicles that already exist for collective action, whether it's political parties, non-governmental organizations, social movements, institutions of government, corporations, universities, all these kinds of ways in which we act collectively, as well as thinking of new ways to act collectively, then I think it's only through doing that we can really realize the kind of potential for freedom of making rules for ourselves that we've been given in the Anthropocene.
I guess I'll use my last comment to speak to the question of freedom. Freedom is a concept which is seen to be definitive of human being, but only in the modern world. It was not the definitive characteristic of being human in the ancient world. For the ancients, for the Greeks, for Plato and Aristotle, humanity, human being in the world was understood as being rational, and rational meant to harmonize your own existence with the order which is in the world. We put a priority on freedom because we live in a period, as I said, I would think significantly influenced by Hobbes and Hume and so on, by a particular philosophical tradition, which vacates being of any specific content, of any meaning, except the meaning which we give it from our own appetites. So freedom, which is definitive of human being in the modern world, is the freedom to act upon one's ungrounded appetites. And it's, I think, a significant part of the problem. It is the expression of the problem that we put freedom at the center of our being.
I think it's important to distinguish between the environmental movement and the left because they have been quite different over the course of the last century. And I mean, as evidence of this is the fact that unions, one of the biggest driving forces for change in the last century, who won weekends and the 8-hour workday or paid vacation and mat leave, only started to care about the environment in the last decade. It was only in like 1999 that they passed any sort of real policies promoting environmental protection. And I'd say this stems from our understanding of nature. As Andrew mentioned, the mastery of nature and what that comes to mean for activism. It goes way back. You could argue all the way back to the Bible and thinking of dominating nature and having it to be named, but it really takes it on a new level in capitalism, in which our values and our interests are, we put onto nature, and which comes into exploitation. And nature becomes something as fundamentally separate and outside of us, distinct. And that's how the environmental movement has tended to think about nature, as external and something outside of us to be protected. And so this artificial conception of environment and nature as very distinct from humans has undermined environmentalism, and the reason that I'd argue that it failed, one of them. There's a couple. But because of that, we see a new need to reimagine what nature actually is and how we give it meaning. And as David mentioned, that there's other examples, there's other models we can follow, be it First Nations and indigenous struggles across North America. Right now, and in terms of environmental activism, we have First Nations really leading the fight. Whether you have fracking in New Brunswick and also Bukduk, or lawsuits coming out against the tar sands, or stuff against the Northern Gateway. And so it's about reimagining that. And also, to follow up again on Andrew's point, it's been a poverty of the imagination in terms of how we organize and what we do collectively. Really, there's no limit. It's about challenging and presenting the contradictions of capitalism while also rethinking our relations and how we actually come together, how we commune. And last but not least, I'll just say in terms of that acting collectively and our imagination, Power Shift Atlantic is coming to Nova Scotia at the end of March, and it's going to be a giant convergence of labor activists, social justice activists, environmentalists, professors, academics. People from across the spectrum are coming together in Halifax at the end of March to build a mass mobilization, a massive movement for climate justice. And it's going to be amazing. The past one in Ottawa and BC have been, and if you're interested in getting involved, there should be a sheet going around somewhere. Thank you. Oh, and thank you very, very much to the organizers and to Sustainability College.
Yeah, I have quite a few, but I realize class is almost over. So I guess what I would do is just leave us with the idea that one way that's very important to rethink nature is to rethink society. Because the way that society sees itself, as Andrew pointed out, definitely affects how we see nature and what we want out of it. If we want to sort of protect or preserve or coexist with nature, I think we're always engaging in collective action, but I think we must rethink and remember that in everything that we do in a society, we are always an active collective. And what that active collective does, the pressures that it puts on the earth for resources, the way that it abuses or uses other humans and non-humans, the way that it structures itself spatially and materially is in many ways the source of so many problems in nature that we're worried about, but at the same time articulate these unfreedoms and oppressions within society. So one problem and I think one reason why the environmental movement has failed is it has not looked enough within the built environments of society, of cities, of economies, to wring out the irrationalities and unfreedoms in them that redound even more destructively in nature, which environmentalists try to clean up the mess when it comes out of the bottom of the pipe, when in fact the issue is, well, where does the pipe come from and what mess is coming out of it? So I think environmentalists need to look not only simply at the green world, but as whatever you want to call it, the brown, the gray, the built existences of the environment as well. Thank you.
We've had a great panel tonight, and I think a shining example of the kind of creative imagination that can come out of discourse. especially when discourse is not directed simply to kind of laying out how a situation is, but also what one might do about it by thinking together about it and discussing together. So I'd like to very much thank Andrew, David, James, and Timothy. I'd also especially like to thank Anthony and the Platypus Affiliated Society for organizing the event for tonight. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out and for the questions.
Really good energy here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just a little token of our thanks. Yours was in your hotel?
I have a 26-year-old daughter who's about that size. So
Great. Awesome.
that was terrific.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, it was great.
Really great conversation.
Thank you. Anyway, kind of funny.
Oh, great. Thanks. That was really good.